This is still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, we return to a case that, well, it rattles people for reasons more complicated than headlines allow. You may know the nickname, the Vampire of Sacramento. That name is loud, grotesque, and it shuts down conversation. So for the next hour, I want us to be quiet and precise. We'll talk about who Richard Trenton Chase was, how he became capable of murdering 6 people in less than a month, and, most important, where the systems around him failed. Joining me is Dr. Lena Morales, a forensic psychiatrist who's worked with psychotic offenders and consulted on insanity defenses. Lena, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mara. I'm glad we can approach this carefully.
Let's start very slowly. Richard Chase was born May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County. He grew up in a household that, by most accounts, wasn't nurturing. Parents who fought, a father described as harsh, a mother later described in psychiatric reports as volatile. From early on, there were warning signs: animal cruelty, bedwetting, fire setting. Some commentators point to the McDonald triad. Others roll their eyes at that as a neat predictor. Lena, what do you look at when you hear that list from a clinical perspective?
First, the triad is a heuristic, not a law. It can appear in the histories of violent people, but it appears in many people who never harm anyone. What matters here is the pattern, the cruelty to animals, the dissection, the early escalating somatic delusions, and social withdrawal. Those form a constellation that in a teenager should have triggered sustained intervention, family therapy, school involvement, psychiatric evaluation over time rather than a single ER referral.
Right. And in Chase's case, he did have repeated contacts with the system. Friends, roommates, and later hospital staff described him as increasingly bizarre, smearing blood, dissecting animals in the bathtub, talking about his blood turning to powder. At around age 15, his mental state, according to later court accounts, was already deteriorating. But it wasn't just private strangeness. He sought help in emergency rooms multiple times. Yet stays were short, and ultimately he was discharged back into the community. Why did that cycle repeat so often?
A few things converged. In the 1960s and 1970s, psychiatry was changing, rightly so, in ways that reduced long-term involuntary commitment. Patients' rights movements and deinstitutionalization meant many people who previously might have stayed in hospital care for months were being discharged sooner. At the same time, community supports were not scaled up. Add substance use, there are reports Chase used marijuana and LSD, and a family dynamic that alternately enabled and rejected him. Clinicians often saw symptoms and treated acute medical risk, but didn't always have the legal or social tools to maintain long-term treatment when a family pushed for release.
Let me ask you about the mother. She comes up a lot. Reports indicate she was aggressive with staff and insisted he could manage at home. How much responsibility falls on family decisions versus institutional policy?
That's a hard question, and one we have to answer with nuance. Families, especially then, often lacked education about psychosis and antipsychotic treatments. Some believed medication made their loved ones worse. If a legal guardian insists on caring for someone at home and the law favors voluntary discharge, clinicians may be constrained. that doesn't absolve the system, it exposes it. Ideally, there would be follow-up outpatient services, assertive community treatment teams, none of which were robustly available in many places at the time. So responsibility is shared. Family choices, yes, but also systemic lack of options.
And that gap between what clinicians wanted to do and what the law allowed might be one of the central threads here. Let's move to the years immediately before the killings. In his 20s, Chase's delusions hardened. He believed his blood was being poisoned, that organs were shifting around in his body. He injected himself with animal blood at one point and developed sepsis. He was hospitalized, diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, given antipsychotics, and then discharged. After discharge, he stopped taking meds, or at least took them inconsistently. At the community level, he began a string of break-ins, odd burglaries, and then the murders in late 1977 and January 1978.
Yes. Clinically, what's notable is the somatic content of his delusions about poison, about blood drying to powder. That kind of fixed belief can become catalytic. If you truly think your blood is failing you, you'd search for ways to fix it. Combine that with a history of animal cruelty, someone who has demonstrated low empathy, and the stage is set for dangerous behaviors. But this is not to conflate all psychosis with inevitable violence. Most people experiencing psychosis do not kill anyone. Chase's history is an extreme confluence of risk factors.
Let's be explicit about the crimes, because accuracy matters, even when the details are painful. The first killing we usually date to December 29, 1977. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old civil engineer, was shot in his driveway, a random drive-by as his family brought groceries in. Then, on January 23, 1978, Teresa Wallen, 22 and 3 months pregnant, was killed inside her home. Evidence showed post-mortem mutilation and blood consumption. And on January 27, 1978, the Meroth House Massacre. Evelyn Meroth, her friend Dan Meredith, Evelyn's 6-year-old son Jason, and a 22-month-old nephew David, killed. The infant's body later found dismembered. The scenes were described by investigators as among the most grotesque they'd seen. Lena, when you read autopsy reports or hear about the post-mortem mutilations and blood consumption, how do clinicians process that? There's horror there, yes, but there's also diagnostic data.
Clinicians look for patterns. Was this sexualized violence? Was it driven by delusional belief? In Chase's case, the mutilation and blood consumption fit his somatic delusions. He believed ingesting blood would restore him. That's a delusional rationale, not a symbolic, ritualistic choice in the moral sense, though it's still monstrous in its effect. Also, the presence of organized acts, he brought a gun, he used unlocked doors as invitations, complicates the picture. Legally, those organized behaviors would be used to argue he knew right from wrong, or could control his actions. Clinically, organization doesn't negate severe psychosis. It simply shows that psychosis can coexist with purposeful acts.
That collision, organized acts, plus psychosis is central at trial. The prosecution leaned into the fact that he purchased a .22, that he selected unlocked doors, that he fled scenes and used a victim's car to escape. The defense argued a man who drinks blood because he believes his blood is going away cannot form malice aforethought. The jury had to choose. Before we get to the trial, I want to talk about the arrest. Investigators tied those casings and ballistic evidence to a single .22. They found his apartment, bloody, with animal and human blood in containers, a blender with tissue. How did law enforcement interpret the apartment when they walked in?
Investigators described it as filthy and insane. walls and surfaces stained with blood, containers with blood and tissue, animal parts. Some items later tested and confirmed to contain human blood. For law enforcement, that was direct physical evidence linking him to the crimes. For psychiatrists, it was evidence of his delusional behaviors manifesting in the home environment. Both perspectives are true simultaneously. The police needed to build a case. Clinicians needed to assess competency and criminal responsibility. Those are different objectives.
At arrest, Chase's comments were chilling in their flatness. He reportedly minimized human killings and framed the apartment as a lot cleaner and said he'd only killed a few dogs. He was described as wild-eyed, tense, and at times bizarrely conversational about unrelated topics, lights in the sky, exploding 747s. Those early interviews fed two narratives, a deeply psychotic man and a calculating killer. Lena, how do forensic evaluators navigate that split? The court asks, was he legally insane? What does that mean clinically and legally?
Legally, insanity varies by jurisdiction, but most standards ask whether the defendant, because of mental disease, lacked the capacity to appreciate the nature and quality of the act or to distinguish right from wrong. Clinically, schizophrenia and psychosis can impair those faculties, but not always. Many people with hallucinations or delusions still know an act is illegal. The harder question is whether the delusion drove the act in such a way that the person couldn't understand its wrongfulness. In Chase's evaluations, some psychiatrists said he was psychotic but still understood criminality. Others emphasized the intensity of his delusions. The adversarial process can polarize opinions because each side wants an expert aligned with their theory.
And in this case, the jury sided with the prosecution. He was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and found legally sane, sentenced to death. The jury's deliberation was reportedly short, suggesting the evidence of planning and purposeful acts carried weight. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge the victims again by name: Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Miroth, Daniel Meredith, Jason Miroth, and David Ferreira. These were real people, families devastated in a blink. Why is it important, Lena, that we keep the victims central in this analysis?
Because turning the killer into an abstract pathology can depersonalize the harm. Families were traumatized, of course, and the moral and legal questions are pressing. Keeping victims central helps balance compassion for mental illness with accountability and acknowledgement of loss. It also directs our attention to prevention. How might earlier interventions have protected them?
That's the question we keep returning to on this show. Could these crimes have been prevented? Looking back, there are multiple failures: short hospital stays, discharge at a family's insistence, lack of consistent outpatient supports, and the ability to purchase a firearm despite psychiatric history. Let's unpack firearms in this era for a moment. Lena, background checks and mental health disqualifiers were different in the 1970s, correct?
Very different. Federal and state systems for vetting purchasers were far less interconnected, and stigma around mental health meant public records weren't routinely available or reliable. People could, and did, obtain guns by lying about their histories. The structural safeguards we discuss today were not in place or were weak. That gap allowed someone like Chase to access a weapon despite repeated psychiatric crises.
So, a lethal combination: untreated severe psychosis and a handgun. After conviction, Chase went to San Quentin, where he died by suicide in December 1980 at age 30, apparently from an overdose of Sinequin he had hoarded. He never faced execution, yet his death didn't close our questions. It stirred a debate about whether the death sentence was appropriate for someone most clinicians said was psychotic. Lena, your thoughts on sentencing someone in his condition to death?
Ethically and clinically, the death penalty in cases involving severe mental illness is fraught. If someone is incapable of appreciating the wrongfulness of their acts due to psychosis, many would argue the moral justification for execution evaporates. The legal standard, however, is narrower and often focuses on observable capacity at the time of the crime. In Chase's case, the jury determined legal sanity. Whether that decision reflects nuance or a societal recoil at the brutality of the crimes is an open question.
I want to circle back to a point you made earlier. Organization can coexist with psychosis. The prosecution emphasized behavior that looked organized: purchasing a gun, using unlocked doors, taking a victim's car. For jurors, those facts are persuasive evidence of planning, but clinically, a delusional logic, "this door is an invitation," might be what guides the behavior, not conventional premeditation. That nuance is easily lost in court.
Exactly. The delusional worldview can create its own internal coherence. To the person inside that worldview, actions aren't premeditated to harm. They're instrumental to a delusion-driven goal. The law asks whether the person knew society labeled those actions wrong. And many people with psychosis do know what's illegal. They may hide it, lie, or take steps to avoid detection. Those are not always signs of sanity in the clinical sense.
So the legal standard is blunt, and the clinical reality is complex. That tension is one of the still unanswered threads. Let's talk about system-level reforms since then. The 1970s saw deinstitutionalization. In subsequent decades, there have been pushes for stronger outpatient commitment laws, for assisted outpatient treatment in some states, and for crisis teams. But these reforms are controversial, balancing civil liberties and public safety. Lena, from your clinical vantage, what would have been the right course of action for someone like Chase in the 1970s, and what should we learn now?
In the 1970s, the clinical ideal would have been sustained multidisciplinary care, prolonged inpatient stabilization when necessary, transition planning, assertive community treatment, medication adherence supported through family and community nurses, and legal mechanisms for involuntary treatment when a person posed a clear risk. Today, we have more sophisticated community models, yet they're patchy and underfunded. The lesson is not simply more hospitalization, but better systems, accessible outpatient care, crisis response teams, better collaboration between law enforcement and mental health, and reducing barriers for families to obtain help without stigma or retaliation.
Families need support, not blame, and clinicians need resources. I want to bring in one more hard question. How do we talk about cases like Chase's without increasing stigma against people with schizophrenia? Most people with schizophrenia are not violent, yet headlines like "vampire killer" stick. How do you handle that in your work?
We have to separate two things in public discourse: the rare, tragic cases of extreme violence linked to untreated psychosis, and the everyday reality that most people with schizophrenia are struggling, not dangerous. In clinical outreach, we say emphasize early intervention, accessible care, and destigmatizing language. In forensic contexts, be precise, describe symptoms, risk factors, and the rarity of violence. Sensational labels do damage by creating fear that discourages people from seeking help.
That's crucial. I want to briefly reconstruct, for listeners, the police investigation and capture because it illustrates both forensics and human memory. Ballistics linked all the shootings, the same 22. Witnesses began to remember a gaunt man who knocked on doors, an unlocked door pattern. A woman recognized him from a sketch and called police. They surveilled his Sacramento apartment, arrested him, and inside found, as we said, evidence of blood and tissue, some human. That forensic link closed the case quickly. But as you said, Lena, forensic certainty about physical acts doesn't resolve the deeper questions about why.
Right. For the investigators, the goal is evidence and arrest. For clinicians and society, the goal is prevention and understanding. Both are necessary.
During the trial, the defense argued insanity. The prosecution argued deliberate, calculated murder. Psychiatrists disagreed, some diagnosing chronic paranoid schizophrenia, others leaning toward antisocial traits. The jury found him guilty and sane. Then came the death sentence. After conviction, life on death row didn't look good for Chase. Reports of paranoia about poisoned food, taunting from other inmates. He hoarded an antidepressant and died by overdose in 1980. No appeals led to execution. It's a bleak end to a bleak story.
It is. But even in that bleakness, there are lessons. The system failed many times. Family, hospitals, law enforcement, the legal system. Lessons point to prevention, not simply punishment.
Before we close, I want to ask you, Lena, about the question that sits at the center of so many readers' and listeners' minds. Was Richard Chase legally sane? The court said yes. You've described how legal standards differ from clinical views. But if you had to explain, carefully and plainly, why a jury might find someone sane, even if most psychiatrists see him as psychotic, how would you put it?
I'd say this. Juries evaluate the totality of behavior they understand as moral or legal agency. If a defendant did things that look goal-directed, obtained a weapon, chose targets based on accessibility, fled to avoid capture, that reads to many as knowing and deliberate. Experts can testify that delusions motivated those acts, but jurors may weigh physical evidence and everyday reasoning more heavily. Also, because jurors are human, the emotional weight of the crimes can make them less receptive to a defense that seems to explain away horrific behavior. So a finding of legal sanity often reflects a jury's conclusion that the defendant had enough functional agency to be held responsible in the eyes of the law, even if clinically many would argue his mental state was severely compromised.
That aligns with many historical cases where the legal lens narrows what counts as insane. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. The early warning signs, the mental health contacts, the brutal murders, the forensic capture, the trial, the sentence, and the death on death row. Let's spend the last 10 minutes on prevention and reflection. If you could advise a city like Sacramento in 1978 or today, what systems would you prioritize to reduce the chance of a similar cascade?
First, expand crisis response capacity, mobile crisis teams that can do risk assessment in the community and, when necessary, facilitate temporary holds coordinated with psychiatric services. Second, build robust outpatient services, assertive community treatment, supported housing, medication management with accessible clinics. Third, family support and education, because families are the front line. Fourth, better information flow for background checks, balanced against privacy concerns, so people under court-ordered commitment or adjudicated dangerousness can't easily access firearms. Finally, cross-training law enforcement to identify mental health crises and divert appropriately, not to criminalize mental illness, but to protect the public and the person.
Those are pragmatic steps. And on the philosophical side, what do you tell clinicians who worry about civil liberties when advocates call for more involuntary treatment?
I tell them to push for safeguards, judicial oversight, time-limited orders, strong review mechanisms, and the least restrictive options. The goal is not indefinite sequestration, it's targeted, evidence-based interventions that reduce imminent risk and stabilize someone so they can live safely in the community. Without safeguards, you risk abuse. With no options, you risk tragedies like this one.
I want to end this segment by returning to the human costs. The names again. Ambrose Griffin. He was bringing groceries home when he was shot. Teresa Wallen, 22, pregnant. Evelyn Maroth, Dan Meredith, little Jason, and baby David. These families carried trauma for decades. The city of Sacramento, people who lived through January 1978, remember the way they started locking doors for the first time. This case is not only a forensic puzzle, it's a set of losses that ripple outward. Lena, any final thoughts before we close?
Only this: that the temptation to simplify, label him a monster, and move on robs us of the responsibility to learn. Complex cases force us to confront uncomfortable trade-offs between liberty and safety, compassion and accountability. If we keep asking the hard questions, we at least make it more likely that someone else won't fall through the same cracks.
Thank you, Lena. For listeners who want to read further, primary sources include court transcripts, contemporary news archives, and psychiatric reports from the trial. I'll link to some of the public resources on the episode page. And for those of you who lived through this, if you want to share your memories of Sacramento in 1978 or comments about the questions we raised, write to us. We read them. This episode of Still Answered was researched using historical records, trial summaries, and psychiatric analysis. I'm Mara Ellison. Dr. Lena Morales, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mara. Take care, everyone.
On our next episode, we'll return to the question of how courts translate clinical uncertainty into legal certainty and what that means for people who live with severe mental illness. Until then, be safe and be kind to one another. This has been Still Unanswered.